Welcome to Props and Hops, a podcast pursuing the best in betting and beer. I'm your host, Matt Landis, and this week our guest is Danny Fullpint, co-founder and editor-in-chief at thefullpint.com, a go-to destination for beer news, reviews, and opinions. Danny's also the host of the Full Pint podcast, and with LA Beer Week around the corner in our neck of the woods and Beer Fest season really picking up across much of the country, this seemed like an ideal time to bring the hops to the forefront. Couldn't think of anybody better to do that with than Danny. Danny, welcome back to Props and Hops.
Matt, thanks so much for having me back on the show. I had such a good time before, and I'm glad you looked me up for another episode. And yes, you are right. It is Beer Fest season.
Can't wait for it. And Danny, before we get too deep into Beer Fest season and all that entails, I'd love it if we could get a macro view of the craft beer industry as a whole. I think last time I had you on the show, probably late 2021, we did a year in beer review show. That was a blast. And in the last year and a half, I'm wondering if we look at things from more of a national level, what are some of the biggest shifts you've seen across the craft beer industry during that time?
Well, I think things are settling out. Some of the data coming back from a lot of the trade industry media would tell you, beer sales are kind of flat right now. And I think what we're seeing now is people just hitting a pause button and, wondering why they're a brewery or what beer drinkers really want anyway. So, we're at a great point right now where maybe the culture isn't what it was a couple years ago in terms of, the different beer events and activities we all used to do and line up for cans of beer and all that. But as far for being a beer drinker, there's no better time than right now in terms of access to good beer. And I think that's what we're seeing right now is maybe the culture surrounding the beverage isn't what it was, but the quality and the access to beer right now is just insane.
And how do you think that bodes for the foreseeable future coming out of what's been a really turbulent past few years driven by the pandemic?
I think this is where things are leveling. So we watched just this growth that was definitely not sustainable and business models that were not sustainable. If you're getting into craft beer thinking you're going to be a rich business owner, those days are over. I mean, you have to just really be wanting to make great beer. This isn't a flipping situation or in your terms, this isn't a great bet. If you're in it for some magical, investment, don't do that. But, I think right now the right people are going to be getting in and the wrong people are going to be getting out.
Sounds like a good overview of everything, again, at a pretty broad level in the industry. And I'll dig in for a moment here on our backyard. LA Beer Week coming up, so more local to a Southern California audience. We've got a kickoff festival coming up June 10th in Long Beach. And Danny, aside from the festival coming up, how would you describe the overall state of LA beer specifically?
Well, it's interesting. So, you mentioned the pandemic and everybody on the drop of a dime had to change the way they did business. They immediately, lost all their draft sales in a year or like, I would say a little less than 2 years to where, everybody started canning, delivering their beer, shipping their beer, making makeshift little restaurants in their parking lots, stuff like that. And so now that that's over, you're seeing now people are, because they shifted to all this packaging. Now they're all kind of fighting for shelf space again. And so right now everybody's trying to figure that magic formula out of, if you go talk to a bottle shop person and say, hey, how's it going? They just said, well, people are just knocking down our doors right to get their beer in here now, but there's just too many players. So I would say it's just very competitive. And, to touch on, with it being LA Beer Week, it's funny. There's always been this great camaraderie in the LA beer scene, but we're now seeing them as competitors more than, playing on the same team. So it's very interesting.
I was going to dig in on that point a little bit because it seems like across LA or pretty much anywhere that I've experienced the craft beer industry, camaraderie has been a really common thread. And now as competition ratchets up, How do you see that dynamic perhaps shifting over time? Or do you see between camaraderie and competition, do you see one of those two ethoses, if you will, winning out in the near to medium term future?
I think it'll be a little bit of a mix, but right now, when the playing field levels out, and there's going to be, some competitors go away, some companies merge. I think then we'll see more camaraderie. Right now, it's just I think it's a very tense situation because there's some of these breweries, whether they're 3 years old or 15 years old, all fighting for survival, all fighting for shelf space, all fighting for the same occasions, right? We all buy more beer on 4th of July and Memorial Day and Labor Day. So they, until they can figure out new ways for people to enjoy beer and new occasions, we're fighting for limited resources.
And one of the big occasions, as we talked about off the top, beer festivals, it is that time of the year. I'm wondering, again, maybe another common thread here. The pandemic really turned things upside down in so many ways for the past few years. So this is not the most significant area of our lives that was affected, but beer festivals pretty much went away for a bit and they've started to come back. It seems like this year is probably the most full calendar of some big beer fests that we've seen since the pre-pandemic era. And given what you're seeing, Danny, being really plugged into the industry, how would you describe the overall state of craft beer festivals?
It seems like people are really into it now. They're feeling safe enough to do it the way we used to do it, and I think people are a little more rejuvenated because they had a year or two off from that. There's a lot of work that goes into a beer festival, and when you're in the beer industry, it's not the same as when you're just a fest goer. So I feel like we're getting, because the beer industry had kind of a year or two off, they're coming into these events more rejuvenated. You're seeing better representation from the breweries where they're not just sending a sales rep with a dirty jockey box. You're getting some brewery owners, some brewers, and you're getting some smiley faces. So right now I think is a great time because everybody's excited.
I like that point a lot because it reminds me of a connection to something a few days ago as we record this on a Mother's Day afternoon. There was the NFL schedule release and so much white noise across the sports betting space about what the schedules for different teams could mean in terms of somebody maybe catching some breaks, being more inclined to have a better season than we'd previously thought, some teams getting tough breaks, and maybe they're in for a rude awakening in some ways because of the schedule. In reality, I feel like the quality of a team over the course of an NFL season will have a lot more say in where they end up than the schedule release in early to mid-May. And one of the thoughts that I had was that it's probably a good time if you're a really serious NFL fan, NFL bettor, if you have other interests, just step away, come back to football in due time. It's going to be there for us. If we come back to it in, July or August recharged, we might even be better for it. In the meantime, it can be so tempting to read into things that aren't really there and have the illusion of an edge based on a schedule release that could possibly be opening up a can of worms more than getting down on some edges. So from a beer fest standpoint, kind of a forced pause for a lot of breweries, but it's cool to hear that, to that same point, if somebody steps away for a bit, whether it's betting the NFL, if it's the craft beer scene and beer fest specifically, sometimes just finding moments to step away can really lead to coming back revitalized and better than ever when you do want to get back at it.
Exactly.
So, Danny, I think king of the beer fests would be the Firestone Invitational. That is a big festival for those who may be unfamiliar with it. Takes place in Paso Robles. I believe it's the first Saturday of every June. So right after
Usually is.
Memorial
Yep.
Day. And you can almost bank on whatever the weather's been like. You're probably going to get 100 degrees and the scorching sun on the day of the Invitational. But nevertheless, the way that they set up this event, in my experience, it's second to none. And I've heard that from a lot of other people that are well plugged into this space. And it sounds like, aside from a really awesome festival that Firestone Walker throws every year, you've got some pretty cool involvement in this year's version of it.
So yeah, I mean, this is something I believe they started in 2012 or 13, and it's kind of the gold standard for beer festivals, in which other breweries are starting to model after this, and So a lot of beer festivals, there's a lot of feelings and respect for the whole ecosystem. So when you go to a bigger beer festival, typically it's whoever's in a group of distributors, or whoever's whatever is in that sales loop. Whereas now these are the people that are coming to Firestone Walker are handpicked by their brewmaster Matt Brenelson. So he gets his favorite breweries from around the world to all come and camp and hang out and talk to the people that are drinking the beer. So it's a curated experience versus hey, let's try and get as many breweries in for unlimited pours and just have a bunch of bros walking around looped out of their head. So this year I will be walking around, working with Firestone Walker, interviewing some of the attending brewers. So that'll be fun. Some of these people I've known for years. Some of these brewers are kind of what you would call the cool kids, and this might be my first opportunity to talk to some of these people, but it's going to be a ton of fun.
That's great. I can imagine side project, a powerhouse brewery usually has a line that'll be, I don't know, dozens, if not 100+ people deep at times. And that can eat up a significant chunk of an attendee's time at the festival. So at least if nothing else, you'll probably have some backstage access to duck in and duck out and connect with some of the biggest players who are going to be there. And one thing I also have to throw in about the Firestone Invitational, I think more festivals can ideally emulate over time. The way they incorporate food and live music, it's not just an event where, hey, some of the best breweries in the world are here, so let's get as many, as you said, like as many pours as we can and just really get hammered on awesome beer. But the whole experience, even if people aren't that into beer, the food, the music, just the space overall outdoors,
Correct.
but still plenty of shade, some panels if people want to hear more about the story and the people behind the beer and the breweries that are represented there. It's really a much more holistic experience that I think avoids some of the degeneracy that you can see at a lot of other beer festivals.
Exactly. And you're so right about the whole the food situation. So there's one place, if you're going to attend and you haven't before, they always have this little truck that does little small batch fried donuts, little beignets and little donuts. And for some reason, and they have this old timey kind of camper food truck they work out of, but they're always the hit every year. But yeah, if you could spend a whole hour just grazing on the food, because unlimited pours, but it's also unlimited tastes of food. So you got to take advantage of that after you got your first couple ticks of beer that you wanted to try. You definitely don't forget about the food portion of this festival.
Yeah, if I can make another connection to my betting half, I would say that sometimes, as much as I love to try to find edges and make positive expected value bets, I know that unless I'm monitoring everything like a hawk, there are going to be edges that I miss. I can't get to everything, and you just have to kind of learn to accept that as a bettor. Similarly, with a festival like Firestone, or for other people, there could be local festivals they'll be attending where there might be a lot that you want, and in a limited amount of time, you're maybe not going to be able to get to everything. And just accepting that up front, just because there's a ton of awesome beer, maybe a lot of awesome food, it's perfectly okay not to get to everything. And it's probably better to intentionally miss out on certain things, but not rush your experience or overwhelm yourself, and just slow down and try to enjoy the moment. So I guess that's kind of a parallel between the betting side of things, the beer fest attending side of things, and a lot of, I think, life overall. Just that slower pace and a more measured approach could do some good for a lot of us, myself included. I'm always wrestling with that kind of dynamic. And Danny, kind of to that end, I guess, if I may ask, beyond just the Firestone Invitational, with beer fests going on across much of the country in the coming weeks and months, what would be some of your top tips overall for people getting excited to start attending some beer festivals that maybe they haven't been to for a while?
So, as a veteran of bottle shares, beer festivals, and I've put myself on mostly almost a timeout in that circle of beer culture. I can tell you they're fun, and one of the problem is you have these little pours, so you're not equating it with drinking a full beer. Therefore, you're not really keeping track of how much beer you have. So always try and do, let's say you have a tasting glass. if you can try and take a shot of water in between your beer tastes, you'll be in a much better spot. If you can hydrate before you even begin, like a lot of products on the market right now, like liquid IV, maybe a little less sugar than say something like Gatorade or Pedialyte. Hydration is key, and pacing is key. It's just I know how fun it gets, and it escalates quick. It's like you've started with a couple pours, you're feeling good. Next thing you know, you're saying no to less things. Your sensibilities go down a little bit because you're having such a great time. And then just realize the next day when you're not feeling good, you'll never be able to know what to blame it on. You'll be like, well, which beer was it that was the one that got me? So
Yeah.
just give yourself time to recover. Give yourself, before you even start, hydrate. And yes, I mean, I think everybody knows, food in the mix is definitely helpful. You can get down a good breakfast in the morning. Even if you're not a breakfast person, or if you're like Mr. or Mrs. Low Carb, just throw that out the window for that day. Go get yourself some biscuits and gravy or a plate of waffles. Just you're gonna thank yourself. You'll thank me. You got to take care of yourself, and it's just when you're in these situations, there's just too much good beer, and you find after a few, you're not turning it down. You're like, this is just a little sip. I'll be fine. But you multiply that and different strengths and different yeast strains, and things get out of hand quick.
I know we're primarily focusing on the hops for the purposes of this conversation, but things that you are saying that really resonate with me, keep drawing parallels to the betting side of things, because when you talk about pacing and saying no to certain things, I'm reminded that one of my mantras, something that I've learned from a lot of really successful people in betting, is that our biggest edge in betting is the ability to pick our spots. If you're looking at, a full slate of games on a college basketball Saturday, during the college basketball season, we could be talking well north of 100 games. Sportsbooks have to put up lines for pretty much everything. We don't have to bet most of those offerings. Most of them are probably right. But if you can just pick your spots here and there, that's how a lot of winning bettors succeed. And I think that's how a lot of people who probably have the optimal beer fest experience go about it as well. Not just during, but also after, to your point about not feeling well the next day, trying to pinpoint where exactly did I go wrong. Oftentimes, again, kind of like betting, it's just, small edges here and there. They tend to play out over time. If you're doing the right thing, you can go on losing streaks, but over time, good habits will compound and pay dividends. Bad habits will have their own effect. Similar with a beer fest, it might not be any one beer or any one decision you made, but oftentimes it's a cumulative effect. So I think when you were giving your answer there, I think when it comes to pacing, just being aware that having a general framework going into it, it's probably not any one decision that's going to make or break things. It's the accumulation of decisions that you'll make during what will hopefully be a very fun and not too damaging several hours.
Right. And then another to your point, and something that I learned late on in my festival going travels, and even at bottle shares or even just tasting beer at home, you should never feel obligated to finish a beer that you don't like or love. So you take a sip and go, oh, that's not for me. It's not like your mama telling you to finish all your peas, right? Dump that beer. You should not be wasting that space in your stomach and your brain for beer that you don't love. So take a sip and you go, oh, this is horrible. Don't do a down the hatch scenario. Don't shoot it. Just put it in the dump bucket and move on.
Well said. Well, speaking of beer that people can love or not love so much, I'd love to touch on a few really popular styles right now and see kind of what the lay of the land looks like and where things might be headed. And of course, with a podcast featuring hops in the name, I'm going to start with IPA. And specifically for the past few years, hazy IPA has been all the rage. I think, Danny, at this point, it's proven itself to be here to stay. But do you think it might have peaked at some point recently or be in the process of peaking right about now?
Well, what's interesting about the hazy IPA space is it went from a niche craft beer that, geeks were lining up for 4-packs, trading it across the country. Now hazy is a mainstream term used by dads who are taking the family out to Applebee's now. So they order a hazy. That is a word. I last fall, I hung out with my cousin, a couple years older than me, and he was like, "Have you tried the Voodoo Ranger Hazy?" And he got a 12 pack of this beer. It is the most approachable style, but it isn't what we think. You and I, beer guys, think of something like monkish, where most of the people in the entire country are thinking about Hazy Little Thing or Firestone Mind Haze or one of those Voodoo Ranger products. So it's definitely part of the lexicon now, and definitely mainstream.
And you touch on monkish, and I like that framework of, yes, for beer geek, especially in Southern California, monkish is at or near the top of the food chain. I mean, they used to sell out all of their releases same day without fail. Now that's no longer the case, but they are still very highly regarded. And I'm wondering, as a lot of people, to your point, might know, shelf stable hazy IPAs that are widely accessible from breweries like Sierra Nevada, New Belgium, and so on. What do you think the future might look like for some of those smaller microbrewery hazy IPA powerhouses that have become so adored in craft beer geek circles?
Right now, and I know this doesn't have much to do with the style at all. People are, having to make hard decisions, and brewers are having to make hard decisions. So on the brewer side of things, where they were selling a $20 4-pack and everybody kind of gasped at that being a high price, at this point, for the cost of labor and the cost of the ingredients and keeping their lights on and all that stuff and brewing the beer, the ingredients, they're almost not making any money on a $20 4-pack anymore. So people, if we're not seeing these lines or people coming out with a dolly to buy these cases, it's because they've had to make a decision of, I need to buy groceries this week, and I don't know if I can afford a $150 case of beer. So I think the beer's as good as ever, and there's still people that are in love with it and they're seeking it out and all that. But there's other things in play right now with the way the economy's going. And if a brewer's now wants to charge $25, $27, $30 for a 4-pack, I just think people are having to make these difficult decisions.
And when it comes to the macroeconomic environment and decisions people are making, do you think that might also be opening the door, staying with the hops, but pivoting a bit to West Coast IPA? If hazy is kind of plateauing a little bit, safe to say that West Coast IPA might be making a comeback here?
I mean, I'm partial to West Coast IPA, but I am now seeing it in vogue, as you're mentioning. It's starting to get a spotlight again. Um, I've talked numerous times on our podcast. There's a product here in Southern California, or a brewery called Pizza Port, and they make a 6-pack of beer called Swami's IPA.
Best value in the market.
So you're getting 2 to 4 week old West Coast IPA for about $12 to $13 a 6-pack, and I don't think there's many beers better at any level than that. And for that freshness, it's just that whole a pie graph of value and quality and availability. So I don't have to go hunt down for Swami's. I just can go to a store nearby and get it. And that counts a lot.
Yeah, a quick betting parallel I'll pepper in there. The value of Swami's. I'll say it's like if you're betting the NFL and you lay 2.5 points in a game that closes with your team favored by 3.5, crossing through that really key number of 3. That value is just something that every bettor is after. And on the beer side of things, about $13 for a 6-pack of 16-ounce cans of a world-class West Coast IPA that you don't have to bend over to find. The accessibility, the approachability, the price point, that kind of value is just off the charts. So I really want to underscore that Pizza Port Swami's IPA call out. And Danny, if we're looking at the arrow pointing up for West Coast IPA, I am afraid that on the other side of the coin, we might be looking at some sour times for sour beer. For a few examples, I look at breweries that I love, like the Lost Abbey, Russian River, Celador Ales. In the case of the Lost Abbey, they have recently downsized both their staff and their production of sour beer, if I'm following correctly. Russian River, I think they're doing better from an overall health of the business standpoint, but I believe I've heard that they're also reducing some of their sour beer production. And then Celador, recent change of ownership and location. Glad to see that they're still in the game. I love what they're still doing, but it's just a turbulent time. And specifically, a lot of these beers aren't the sours that you'd catch at a lot of breweries where casual people are just going up and ordering whatever sours on the board that, maybe you could speak better to, a kettle sour versus a barrel-aged sour. Lost Abbey, Russian River, Celador, a lot of breweries that are known for making world-class examples of this style. A lot of people love it. It's just tough to really scale a business at this point when it comes to the state of some of those more traditional, again, world-class takes on sour beer.
So I used to, when I was deep into, bottle buying, collecting, trading, club memberships. So I'm still in a Sante Adarius club, and that's a brewery up in Capitola, California, near Santa Cruz. And they do mixed culture saisons. So these beers are very fancy, very tart, elegant, almost wine or champagne like. And I stare at them in my beer fridge because they're so fancy that it's not something I want to crack on a Tuesday night, right? If I need a beer after work. And I think, it's a you have to have a taste or a hankering for like a barrel aged, properly made sour beer. And they're so fancy, you're always trying to find a special occasion for it. And I think, brewers realize that the sweet and sour space is still something a beer drinker appreciates. So when you go to a tasting room, you'll see a quote unquote sour beer on the menu, but that'll oftentimes be, a fruit beer that's been made a little bit puckering with some different bacterias and acids, not necessarily in the old way of, Belgian style beer that, has taken time in a barrel and has, naturally fermented and all that. So it's still there's a cheaper, more approachable way to do it. And that's, when you reference the term kettle sours, that's what you'll find at your tasting room these days, because it's just a hard sell for, like, you mentioned Russian River. They have an extensive barrel program, wine barrels that they're aging this sour ale in aligned with how, those traditional beers are made in Belgium, but people are just not buying it and enjoying it at the clip they used to. So it's very resource intensive. So it just makes it difficult to maintain a program for beer that doesn't have a big demand.
I see a lot of parallels between what you had to say there on sour beer and stouts as a style. Again, the occasionality of everything. And in some cases, there's a traditional way of doing things, but it might be more time and resource intensive. So there are ways to shortcut the process and still maintain approachability to a scalable audience. When it comes to stouts, I am, a big sucker for a good barrel-aged stout, but I've come to think that less is often more in terms of smaller formats, maybe more selective with adjuncts. I mean, who these days needs a 22-ounce Balmer of what equates to a liquid almond joy? So I think of an example like Horace Aged Ales, which I know that's not an accessible brewery for a lot of people to get their hands on. It's exclusively club-based. To any listeners who are dying to get their hands on it, if you reach out to Danny or myself, odds are you might be able to get a taste or two. But using even Kyle's approach, who runs Horace as an example, I've seen recently a lot of his beers have been smaller bottles and few, if any, adjuncts compared to what he was cranking out a few years ago. And I've really come to appreciate it because I feel like that's a case of quality over quantity. And maybe there's less of a threshold for the occasionality of something if I'm cracking open a 12-ounce bottle of something that if I want to, I can consume it by myself versus a 22-ounce bomber that if I don't have some good company, I know that's not going to get finished.
Well, and that's the thing is, so I'll touch on a few things. So, the less is more. So I think, stout has come full circle where it was the hot ticket item was just a bourbon barrel aged stout, nothing higher. And then I think it was probably about 2011, 2010, Cigar City over in Tampa, Florida. They had their Hunapoo stout with chilies and cinnamon and cocoa and blah, blah, blah. And everybody just went ape for that. They just were like, okay. So then everything became a vanilla coconut, almond joy delight. And I'm right now, because I still pay attention to all the different aspects of beer culture. I'm seeing people try to unload these big lots of brewery beers, Bottle Logic beers, Modern Times beers, and they're all these over the top dessert stouts that everybody thought they were going to be drinking a lot of, and they're just like, wait a minute, I'm actually not. So when a brewery comes out with a classic single barrel aged stout, it's a treat now, because we veered so far from the light.
And tying in with that theme, approachability really being king these days. I feel like that's something I've come to appreciate a lot more. It doesn't need to be the fanciest beer to be sustainable and really, I think, at the top of the line in terms of what you can get as a craft beer fan, whether you're really into it or just casually or at the very beginning of your journey starting to appreciate it. I think of examples like Green Cheek Beer Company, Highland Park Brewery. They have a lot of hop forward offerings. They do some very well balanced West Coast IPAs, and they do some really good hazy IPAs as well. But if you look at their menu, you'll also find lagers, dark beer, oftentimes even wine, maybe some slushies here and there. And that makes me think that while some beer geeks might cringe at the notion of slushies or wine on a beer board at a really good craft brewery, beer is ultimately a really social product. And I've come to see the power in having something for everyone. It's not just enough to appeal to the craft beer geek alone. So, Danny, maybe there are other examples beyond Green Cheek and Highland Park, but have you seen this as part of a bigger trend as well? Or is that just me having a little bit of tunnel vision toward two breweries that are near and dear to my heart?
It's in being inclusive with in terms of, okay, not everybody here likes beer. So how do we have everybody have a beverage in their hand to have a good time? And that's really what it comes down to. I was in Minneapolis a few weeks ago, and I checked out that I've probably been to about 10 breweries there. And it was wild to me. The lineup of beers was like the kettle sour, an IPA, a stout, but then it was going seltzer, THC seltzer. And I'm like, okay, if you can't find something out of that lineup, they're really trying to keep people engaged and happy. So I used to be one of those beer geeks that was like, get this out of my brewery. I don't want to see this seltzer. But now I'm like, I get it. If I owned that business, I would be doing the same thing.
And I think that makes a lot of sense. And at the same time, perhaps introduces a little bit of tension. What's your viewpoint, Danny, on one hand, doing something for everybody, and on the other hand, not compromising your identity or keeping top of mind as a brewery, quality being as high as it can possibly be for what you do best?
Well, I think your mission statement still has to be met, and if you have just some little side venture like Green Cheek makes it's probably the best seltzer I've ever tried. It's a lavender lemonade seltzer, but that's not on the marquee for them. They're not Green Cheek Seltzer Company. They're not trying to draw people in with this, but they do some fun stuff at a much smaller scale to keep people happy. So I think as long as people keep their messaging and their mission focused, it's not a problem. It's when there's companies that clearly don't know what direction to go into, it's sign of bad times ahead.
All right. Well, Danny, keeping with the spirit of this also being a betting podcast, love all the focus on beer here. Maybe we can tie the two worlds together a little bit. In terms of betting, a big part of the lexicon is bad beats, a bet that somebody was hoping to and feels like they really should have won that just didn't break their way. And if we apply that notion to the craft beer industry, how would you describe perhaps one or two of the biggest losing bets in the space that you've witnessed over the last 1 or 2 years?
I think anybody who's kind of familiar with beer has seen Stone Brewing Company, Arrogant Bastard, Stone IPA. You're at a baseball game or something at an arena, you could probably get a Stone product at this point. I would say about 5-10 years ago, they bet on being the biggest independent brewery in the world, in multiple continents, and that they were sticking their nose at large beer conglomerates, and they wound up getting in so much debt that they had to sell to a big major beer conglomerate. So they really bet on themselves and their messaging, and in the end, it may have backfired.
Yeah, having grown up in North San Diego County with Stone in my backyard, that one definitely stung and hit close to home. But on the flip side, there are also times where maybe there were bets that somebody shouldn't have won and things just happened to break favorably. So, to look at the positive side of things, what would you say about perhaps one or two of the biggest winning bets that you've seen in recent years in the craft beer space?
Gosh, I hope you edit this good.
People are going to hear the authentic experience. The silence is speaking volumes.
Yeah, I can't come up with a winning bet right now. I've seen some, some mergers that I thought were definitely good for the business, or good for, like, so right now Bear Republic was one of the last independent craft breweries here in California from the legacy days. I'm sure everybody's at least seen or heard of Racer 5 IPA. And rather than Bear Republic going out of business, they got acquired and kind of partnered up to a second act with Drake's Brewery. So I thought that was definitely a smart move. Similarly, Cellar Maker acquired the Rare Barrel, which was, back to our topic about sour beer. Instead of trying to sell to somebody or just full on folding, they got a new leg on life, or new lease on life, by being acquired by Cellar Maker. So it could have gone many worse ways than it did, but that's what I would call a happy ending.
Yeah, two of the powerhouses in the Bay Area. Glad to see that they could team up and keep both brands alive to a certain extent. I know Cellar Maker being the dominant party there, but I think that was pretty well received as far as a lot of the mergers go that we've seen in recent years. And Danny, maybe your answer to this next question would be merger related as well. Maybe not, but for you, if I'm to put you on the spot as a bettor yourself, looking ahead, what would you say would be your personal biggest bet on the beer industry that might get graded in the next 1 to 2 years?
I think we will see more mergers and acquisitions. Definitely, from just like we just saw, we're talking about with Cellar Maker and the Rare Barrel. I think we'll see some Southern California breweries that are finding the times to be too tough to navigate and might have to band together with other craft breweries. So we're going to be seeing a lot more alternating proprietorships. We're going to be seeing a lot more contracts for contract brewing. I think we're in a place of transition right now and survival.
And I'd like to dig in on this just a bit because I think when mergers and acquisitions comes to mind for people with a cursory knowledge of craft beer, it's often in recent years been AB InBev or Miller Coors, one of the big breweries, Heineken, coming in and acquiring a craft brewery. But in this case, it sounds like you're thinking more within the craft beer circle, independent breweries working together. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? What contract brewing could look like and how this could possibly be a sustainable way of moving forward in the industry, but keeping it more or less confined to that independent circle of craft breweries?
There was a false sense of continuous growth about 5-10 years ago. So a lot of people bought a lot of tanks and a lot of square feet and a lot of warehouses and a lot of refrigerated spaces, with the notion that everybody was going to keep growing and sell. And now we have lots of stainless steel. We have lots of square footage not being utilized. So people are going to get, they're going to get pretty crafty right now to stay alive and weather this storm, so that they don't have to default on these loans they've all taken out. So you're going to see maybe, people sharing a brew house with a new company that's starting up and doesn't want to have to get the capital to build a brew house. You're going to see maybe people turn half of their warehouse into an event space, or, kind of a beer garden or a beer hall. You're going to see people doing creative things to stay in business. And, as a byproduct, I think the customers will win because we're now seeing creativity out of necessity.
As you tell that story, I'm reminded of, once again, a betting parallel, go figure. But going back in the history of betting, Old Vegas, there is a legendary bookmaker, Scotty Shetler. I met him last year at an event called Bet Bash, and he was up there with some legends in the space telling some often hilarious stories of the history of betting when Vegas was really getting off the ground. And Scotty's also written a book called We Were Wise Guys and Didn't Know It. And something that stood out to me reading the book, I don't think this took place at the Stardust, which is where he was known to do a lot of his work, a legendary sports book back in its day. This might have been, was it the Royal? I don't know. Really avid bettors are going to crucify me for not knowing the exact spot. But there was a location in which they basically took up shop for the sports book in a burlesque room at a casino. And by day, they would drop a curtain on the burlesque show, turn the chairs one way, and it was essentially facing the sports book and all the odds and all that. And then at night, they would close down the sports book and flip everything around, and you're just looking at the stage for the burlesque show. And it was just a really funny juxtaposition, but also a pretty scrappy and efficient use of space. So I feel like something that was going on in the betting industry decades ago, you kind of bring it full circle. A lot of craft breweries needing to get scrappy and efficient might be looking at maybe not quite as disjointed things as burlesque and betting, but really trying to make more efficient, optimal use of their time and space as well.
Exactly.
Danny, I'd like to go into a rapid fire round, if you will. And let's start with, again, beer styles. We touched on a few of the big ones earlier. In your book, what is Danny Fullpint's most overrated beer style?
Most overrated beer style would probably have to be the pastry stout.
All right. And then most underrated beer style?
Helles Lager.
All right. I am going to be in Europe in a few months, so I might have to hit you up for some recommendations to get some epic takes. I won't be, in the, I guess, origin spot of the Helles, but a lot of good takes on the style. So we will be following up there offline. I think we can make a safe bet on that. Moving on from styles to hops, what would you say is your favorite hop varietal?
Right now, it's Strata.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I like that because I feel like it's gaining some steam, but it's not a sexy hop like a Citra, Mosaic, Nelson, and so on.
Yeah,
A
I
lot
think
of
that's
hops that get a lot
I
of
think
play.
it's going to be getting its due. I get some in some beers. I'm getting almost like a lime lollipop kind of vibe from it. It's El Segundo Brewery down near LAX. They do some really great beers with Strata.
All right. And then I might have just named a few contenders for this next question, but how would you identify in your book what is the most overrated hop varietal?
Mosaic for me, I think it's way overrated, way overutilized. It's definitely a crutch for a lot of uh, hazy makers and IPA makers.
And then what would you say when you say it's a crutch? What would make Mosaic hops a crutch in ways that perhaps other hop varietals would not be?
It's very pungent. It's really like it's very I mean, it for all the reasons why people love it is why I also think it's just heavily relied on. It's got all those dank tropical smells and flavors that you can imagine, but I just think it's been overused as, a star of the show.
And I will make yet another parallel to the betting world, but okay, let's say in betting, if the Lakers are playing the Denver Nuggets, game one of the Western Conference Finals, last I saw the line was Denver -5. There's a chance that just because we're talking about the same game between the same two teams, some sports books might go down to Denver -4.5. Some books might go up to Denver -5.5. So the same game does not necessarily equate to the same odds across the board. Similarly, piggybacking on your point about Mosaic hops, oftentimes just because it's Mosaic hops doesn't mean that all things are created equal. Different lots, different years of harvests can mean different things for the same hop varietal. And sometimes I've heard people say that Mosaic might be really fruit forward. Again, I get some people talking about blueberry as well. Sometimes I hear people say Mosaic can be off-putting and almost have onion notes. So it can be a little bit all over the
I'm
map.
in
Have
that
you gotten
camp.
much of that
So
as well?
so I just think it's kind of used like a brand name at this point. You see it and you think you're guaranteed a perfect experience. And I get those weird off flavors that some people do not get. And so I know I don't love it like most people do.
All right, well, let's get back into something that you do love. If we're thinking about zooming way out for any international listeners to the show, a global audience, Danny, what's your favorite beer produced right now that is made outside of the United States?
That's a tough one. Um, I had a wonderful experience a couple of weeks ago drinking. I think it's Bavik Super Pills.
Mm. Do you
And
recall where that was made?
I'm gonna look it up for you real quick.
Bavik Super Pills.
Yeah, it is made in Belgium.
Ooh, there we go.
Bavik.
All right, Bavik Super Pills. We'll keep that one high on the radar. And aside from specific beers, Danny, any favorite beer drinking destinations outside of the U.S.?
Outside of the US, I've not gone anywhere epic to drink beer outside of the country, unfortunately. It's on my list of things to do. I've drank beer in Mexico, the Philippines, but I wouldn't say either of those were epic beer experiences.
All right, well, let's make it still broad, but at a national level across the U.S., any favorite beer drinking destinations that have stood out in your experience?
There is definitely one that's just in my heart. There's a brewery. They've now have three like tap rooms now. It's called Human Robot out of
Mm.
Philadelphia, and they are absolutely killing all old world style lagers. But then they also flex their talent with a hazy or something like that. Something not an old world lager, but everything they do is perfect right now.
Love it. Plenty of love for the loggers thus far in this conversation. Danny, next question I want to ask. We touched on a worthy candidate earlier. Let's try to rule out Swami's IPA for the purposes of something new in the conversation. But on a pretty broad national ish level, how would you describe your, let's say, one or two go to beers that are both accessible and affordable?
If it's a reasonable date code on it, I would say Bell's Two Hearted Ale is definitely a good IPA that you can get almost anywhere now.
That's a classic. I feel like Bell's Two Hearted and Pliny the Elder used to be neck and neck in some of the OG beer publications for the
Yep.
best craft beer every year.
Yep. So yeah, definitely Two Hearted Ale is a good one.
All right. And then drilling down on our backyard here in Southern California, Danny, what would you say are some of the best beers and breweries in Southern California right now?
I gotta give love to North Park Beer Company,
Mm.
out of San Diego. Uh, I don't need to remember all the names of their West Coast IPAs. Their one flagship is called Hop Foo, but they keep things interesting by rotating. They're probably pumping out like six different beers a week to sell in cans, maybe more. Now, one of my friends, brewers at Pizza Port Carlsbad, left to start brewing at a new company called Heritage Brewery and Barbecue in Oceanside. That's some of the best beer. I mean, Mike from Pizza Port, now Mike from Heritage, is one of the best brewers in the world, and now you can get his magical beer at Heritage. So that's a good one. And then obviously here closer to home, LA, Highland Park, definitely making very delicious styles, lagers, IPAs.
Yeah, pretty much across the board, Highland Park firing on all cylinders. And to circle back on your note about Mike, who's gone from Pizza Port to Heritage, again, for a lot of sports fans listening who might not be knee deep into craft beer, a parallel I could make would be coaching trees. We often think about, okay, who spawned off from, this one legendary coach to make a life of their own. And the virtuous cycle that coaching trees has become a very common talking point in sports and even in some betting circles. I feel like Pizza Port would be the pinnacle of the coaching tree equivalent in craft beer circles. Can you speak to a few historical examples that could then maybe lend further optimism for the way you're feeling about Mike and what he's going to be doing with Heritage moving forward?
Well, and it's funny. So Pizza Port's kind of like this incubator of brewers. I mean, Ryan Fields started at Pizza Port. Um, the guys who went to St. Archer and now Harlan Beer started off at Pizza Port.
Jeff Bagby, if I'm not mistaken.
Definitely Jeff Bagby.
Tommy Arthur.
Tommy Arthur. I mean, it's just like it's an incubator for great beer. And so I don't get sad when people leave. Blake from Craft Coast. It's just they get trained on the right way to do it, so to speak, and they have a good career, and then they leave the nest, and someone else gets trained to be the best. So they really have it down there.
I think of some elite college football programs who every year it seems like they're losing half of their offense or half of their defense to the first round of the NFL draft, and yet they stay so good. It's almost like they don't rebuild, they just reload. And I think when you mentioned it with Pizza Port, you don't get sad when somebody leaves because you know that that person's probably going to succeed where they're going, and Pizza Port probably somehow still has the infrastructure to replace that person and not really skip a beat. That's just remarkable. I feel like so many breweries, if they lost one or two key pieces, that could really be, almost like pulling the wrong block from Jenga. It's game over. And in Pizza Port's case, it's just they keep chugging along seemingly no matter what.
And then people, we have one example off the top of my head up at Firestone Walker, gentleman named Brendan. Brendan, he went to Slow Brewing, I believe it was, or no, maybe it was Central Coast Brewing, and then has opened up Liquid Gravity. And so right now, Liquid Gravity is making some amazing IPA. And I believe he's very talented, but, got to learn on some of the best equipment under the best, leadership possible. So, and those kind of, like, when I hear like someone leaving a big company like Firestone to start their own place, I'm like, okay, that should be good. So,
yeah,
all about pedigree.
Yes. Well said. Pedigree, a good word that can apply whether we're talking beer or betting on the sports side of things. And Liquid Gravity, I feel like they've been making some moves. I feel like I might have just seen them announce a second location. Maybe I'm behind on that, but it seems like they're growing, which is a great signal at a time when for a lot of breweries it's just like staying flat is the new growth. To see them opening a new spot seemed like a pretty promising sign. And then just to circle back, I wanted to make sure that we weren't getting too esoteric. Earlier, I mentioned Jeff Bagby and Tommy Arthur off of the Pizza Port brewing tree, if you will. Tommy Arthur is the man behind the Lost Abbey, and then Jeff Bagby. Speaking of old world beers, a lot of love for lagers on the show. Bagby Brewing in Oceanside, or excuse me, I think it's Bagby Beer Company in Oceanside. It's not the place we're going to find all the hype beers, but if you just want really well-made styles that you're not going to find at a lot of other locations, they do it just about as well as anybody.
Agreed.
Danny, one more question for you. And I guess this rapid fire round hasn't stayed rapid fire the whole time, but it's taken us down some fun detours. What would you say are some of the best destinations in Southern California right now, given your familiarity with the area, for let's say a diverse group of friends? And it could include some beer geeks, some people that are into Bud Light or wine or seltzer or non-alcoholic, or perhaps not even drinkers, but just beer destinations that provide that kind of welcoming, very inclusive experience for a broad array of people. What are some of the first spots that come to mind?
Well, whenever I pick up family that comes to visit me in LA, if you have to go to through the daunting task of going to LAX. And so what I'll often do is, instead of getting back on the freeway for an hour or whatever, we'll swing a right over to El Segundo's Slice and Pint. So El Segundo Brewery opened up a pizza parlor, and it really feels like that to me, from something back east, where they have the picnic table style setting, and some of the best pizza I've had in the whole country, along with beers. And of course they have other things besides beer for the non-beer people. So that's usually my go-to whenever I pick up friends or family from the airport. There's destination for a wide group of people. I know in San Diego, Pure Project has kind of made some vibes for a crowd that I would say is not necessarily beer people, but beer happens to be something to do there, so to speak. And I'm not sure if you've experienced that.
Yeah, actually, this would have been October of 2021, I believe. I ran a half marathon down in San Diego, and it pretty much started in Balboa Park next to a Pure Project location. I was with my wife, who doesn't drink, and her mom and her mom's boyfriend, and they are more on the Bud Light kind of side. Her mom also into wine, but we had the best time at Pure Project the night of the half marathon. There were slushies from the slushie machine that my wife and her mom were really enjoying. There was even a barrel-aged stout that I was amazed. George, my mother-in-law's boyfriend, he was just really into it, and I had never seen him go after a dark beer. So I knew that I was going to be well taken care of there. But between everything they had going on with their tap list, the slushie machine, and then a really good pizza spot next door, kind of like you said with El Segundo, that just knocked it out of the park in ways that we didn't even anticipate.
You're right, exactly. And I think, I don't know if I went to the same one, but it's been decked out in plants from our friend Matt Olesh, who is the plant guy now in San Diego. So if you see beautiful plants everywhere at a brewery, it's probably from our friend Matty O.
Random question off the reservation a bit, but I also think of Burgeon when I hear breweries in San Diego with anything plant related. Burgeon's logo, even being that tree that turns into like the beer glass. Is Matt related to them in any way, or do you think there's some synergy
I wonder,
between what he's doing in Burgeon?
I think Matt might be involved with that. I have to ask him for that one. I know he definitely is doing Booze Brothers and Pure Project.
Got it. All right. Well, San Diego is just an embarrassment of riches. So even if they're not doing the same thing intentionally, it seems like there's a common thread there that's fun to see. And Danny, as we start to round the home stretch, I would like to weave in what I've dubbed the Malinsky Minute on this show, a nod to the late great sports betting legend David Malinsky. And I will turn this into a two-parter. I kind of prepped you a bit for one question themed around how well-rounded Dave was. But over the course of this conversation, I've thought of Dave when he mentioned the donuts that people need to check out if they're going to the Firestone Invitational. Don't get so caught up in the beer that you lose sight of some of the good food, and that, donut spot serving out of an old trailer sounded really cool. Possibly some very good pairings with a stout or a sour beer to go along with it. You mentioned, was it, who is it from? Is it Mike from Pizza Port, who's now with Heritage?
Yes.
Heritage, I mean, what they're doing on the barbecue side, just pick, pretty much anything on the hoppy side, or probably anything crushable on the lager standpoint. There are so many options to pair with good barbecue. El Segundo, you talked about their pizza spot and how you can take family for some good beer and pizza once you're making those daunting LAX runs. So a lot of beer and food pairing possibilities have come to mind. And geez, it's crazy. It was 5.5 years ago now, the 2017 NFL season. I had the thrill of a lifetime hosting a podcast called House of Yards with David Malinsky, and he just brought epic sports betting wisdom to each conversation, but he also loved picking my brain about beer and food pairings. I would do a beer of the week with each episode, and his follow-up would always be, what could we pair this with? How could we play around in that sense? So as you've talked about possible beer and food pairings at the Firestone Invitational, at Heritage Barbecue, at the Slice and Pint by El Segundo, is there anything among those three, or perhaps something totally different from those three, that stands out when you think about your favorite ways to pair beer and food together?
I mean, I love big flavor. So for me, a really well made West Coast IPA, some spicy food, or some barbecue, some smoked food, I think they're a natural fit.
Can't go wrong with that. And I think you also can't go wrong in life just trying to be, again, we talked about it a bit off the top, trying to be a bit more well-rounded at times. I think of Dave as a sports bettor. He had a phrase, going off the grid. He would often just get immersed in hiking, mom and pop restaurants around the Las Vegas area. He was a big classic rock fan, with Bruce Springsteen, I think, being at the top of his list. Also, when he wasn't betting and had time to enjoy beer, wine, and spirits, he was just such a well-rounded person. I still don't understand how he made such good use of the same 24 hours in a day that the rest of us get. And Danny, to turn this question on you, when you're not occupied running the Fullpint, the website, the podcast, and all that you're doing there, what would you say are some of your ideal ways to get off the grid?
I hate running. I hate doing any kind of strenuous exercise. I'm very lazy, but I walk anywhere between 2 and 4 miles a day just around my neighborhood at whatever pace I want. And I just take a walk. Always makes me feel better. And then the big ha is, so I make sourdough, and everyone said, "Oh, you're one of those sourdough pandemic bakers." And it's funny, was I picked it up right before the pandemic, so I was on that trajectory anyway. It's a very humbling activity that there might be 20 some steps to it, and if you screw up any one of those steps along the way, you at the end have wasted a lot of time if you didn't get all the steps correct. So it's humbling, and it's one of my favorite hobbies currently.
For people who might be relatively new into it, who a bit deeper into the pandemic picked up what became a very popular hobby, you mentioned all the steps, and if one thing goes wrong, then it's kind of like the weakest link can wreck everything. What are one or two things that you've picked up on as you've really immersed yourself in sourdough bread making that other people might stand to learn from if they're earlier on in their journey with that hobby?
I think the biggest mistake I made at the beginning is you read a recipe, and I'm also a barbecue guy too. So you have to you got to have a second nature feel for it. You can't read a recipe or a set of instructions and expect perfect results from that. So in terms of dough making, there's time to let the dough proof or, develop. And if you are reading a recipe that says, let this dough sit on your counter for 4 hours, there's too many variables to take that as the gospel. So it's like, if your house is really warm, or if your house is really cold, or if you have some funky city water, or if you forgot to put salt, like there's all these things. So you have to know when your dough is ready. You can't just say, oh, 4 hours, time to go to the next step.
I'll make one more parallel to the betting world in this conversation, and that reminds me a lot of betting often talked about as both an art and a science. There's no one size fits all approach to just, okay, I do this one thing well, I follow this process, and I'm good to go. It's constantly evolving, and in some ways it requires getting pretty scientific, and in other ways you just have to embrace the art that goes into all of it. And I think that ties in with the impetus of this conversation, the craft beer world as well. I mean, I feel like there's a reason that Vinny at Russian River is, if I'm not mistaken, pretty open about the Pliny the Elder recipe, because even if you know how much of every little ingredient to use and how to follow a step by step, it does not mean that you're going to be able to recreate Pliny pretty much anywhere outside of Russian River's brew houses.
Correct.
Danny, one more thing I want to do before we wrap up. I want to make sure that we can plug everything you've got going on at the Full Pint. Again, a go-to website for beer news, events, and opinions. A great podcast as well. I think that's a must-listen for anybody with even a casual interview in the beer space. How would you describe the state of the Full Pint these days, and perhaps any upcoming events or collabs that you've got in the works?
So the Full Pint is chugging along. We're going on, I believe, our 16th or 17th year, and I'm trying to dial back from mentioning that because it makes us sound very old. And we're dropping about 2 podcasts a month, and we're just watching. We're watching what's going on right now. And I in my earlier years, I was an open critic of the beer industry, and I think right now I'm taking a step back from that and watching it evolve and trying to remember why we're all doing this. We're doing it because we love beer. And if I get too far in the weeds about, breweries closing or breweries getting in trouble for horrible conduct, or whatever the case may be, whatever the news cycle is, that, the spirit of the Full Pint was, we want to celebrate our favorite beverage. So I still I'm trying to maintain our, we have a fun edge. I'll put it like that, is we always have a hot take ready to give out. And you've heard plenty of them today on this show, but maybe there's a more kinder, gentler Danny Fullpint for the next chapter.
Love to hear it. Well, Danny, thank you for bringing that spirit to this conversation. To anybody in the audience who's not doing so already, would highly encourage you to follow Danny's work on Twitter at The Full Pint. You can also catch the Full Pint podcast. Danny, once again, thank you for the time and insight.
Thank you, my brother.
And to the audience, thank you for tuning in. I'll catch you again next week with a new episode right back here on Props and Hops.